Hello, young world. How you guys doing today? My name is Tyler Campbell, and we're excited to be here in conversation with the lovely Lucy Lane. We're talking about a whole bunch of things related to the criminal justice and the current DA's race. I am currently a rising senior at Columbia University, and I am the program coordinator and lead instructor for the Justice Ambassadors Youth Council when I'm the Center for Justice at Columbia. The Center for Justice does a lot of work, but namely the Justice Ambassadors is, in my opinion, the crown jewel of the Center for Justice. We do a whole bunch of work with involving young people. The two individuals who will introduce themselves in a moment are former Justice Ambassadors. The Justice Ambassadors, to kind of explain it a little bit, is a unique platform for 18 to 24-year-olds residing in New York City, some justice involved, some not justice involved, to kind of come and sit down and have really meaningful conversations with city officials around current issues in the city. It's the only kind of classroom structure that brings kind of formerly incarcerated and formerly justice involved young people in a room with the people who are essentially governing their lives and city officials. City officials ranging from the Manhattan DA's office, Brooklyn DA's office, NYPD, Department of Education, Board of Education, among a couple others. We talk about a whole bunch of different issues, and the goal at the end of it is to kind of have joint policy proposals kind of get published. These two lovely individuals, who I'll pass the mic to in a second, are two of our star alums who have, kind of come up with some really, really amazing policy proposals in their time. And so we're excited to have this conversation with Lucy Lane and, hear about some of her work and kind of, get to know each other a little bit. So I'm going to pass it to you, man.
All right. Hello, my name is Emmanuel Dowdy. I'm currently a junior at Cornell University, and I help run the Prison Reform and Education Project at Cornell. And in addition, I help give consulting services to New York City youth looking at going to their colleges through my program called Branches. And so, of course, like Tyler said, I am a former Justice Ambassador, and I hope that in this whole process that we can get some excellent insight into what you're trying to do. Personally, I'm all about trying to make juvenile offenders have their voice heard throughout the process to make sure that their justice is not impeded. So hearing ideas about that is always going to be on my heart. That's all.
Hi, my name is Mackenzie. I'm a recent graduate of Columbia University. I will be an English teacher in the fall, and I'm also a graduate of the Justice Ambassadors Youth Council. I'm really excited to be here today. So yeah, let's get started. Oh, sorry.
I'm Lucy Lang. I am a candidate for Manhattan District Attorney in the upcoming election, which is just over 2 short weeks away on June 22nd. But early voting starts on June 12th, so make sure to get out and make your voice heard. The district attorney is only one of many positions on the ballot, but it is unique in that it is not ranked choice like all the other elections that will be on the ballot this June. So you're going to vote for one candidate for district attorney. I ran a national criminal justice reform organization. I served as an assistant district attorney here in Manhattan. One of the greatest joys of my life has been working alongside the founder of the Justice Ambassadors program, Jarrell Daniels, and I bring that perspective to the role of DA. So I hope that on June 22nd or during early voting, I'll be your pick because there is nothing more important than that the voice of youth be heard, especially with respect to the criminal justice system. Thank you all for having me today.
Sure, so why don't we just go ahead and get started. I guess the first question for you is, as a black woman working inside the criminal justice, working to make criminal justice changes, kind of what would you say, how you incorporate, your own implicit biases and kind of work against those to kind of really reach the community you're trying to help?
It's one of the most important questions that any leader has to face is how their own privilege and bias informs the decisions that they make. And it's been something that I have really actively worked against throughout my career and continue to learn and expand around. So as you all may know, but for the listeners, when I served as an assistant district attorney, I had at the time it seemed crazy idea to create a college and prison course to bring together assistant district attorneys, the prosecutors who run the criminal justice system, and incarcerated New Yorkers in classroom settings to work on criminal justice reforms together. That's where I met Jarrell, and it's that model on which he based the Justice Ambassadors, which is changing lives all over the city now. And I built that program in large part because of exactly what Tyler just pointed to, that I am aware of my privilege as a white woman and a white woman who served at the district attorney's office. And it was one way to develop my own skills of cultural humility and try to understand the full breadth of New York City's communities, and in particular, communities most impacted by the criminal justice system.
Thank you. I guess I have a follow-up question, related to that a little bit. Something I see all the time is, Black Lives Matter made a huge splash last summer, and so now it's almost vital that you're inside of Black and brown communities if you want to win in New York City, right? So everybody's trying to, reach the Black voters in some capacity. So I'm wondering what you would do if you're elected to kind of, make sure that their voices are still incorporated inside of your work post-campaign should you win.
I'm so glad you asked. I've been a resident of Harlem for almost 20 years, and I always thought that it was critically important as someone who handled many crimes that happen in and around Upper Manhattan to live in the community that I was serving and working in, and to work alongside my neighbors as a member of the Block Association, for example, to understand the issues not just from the perspective of an assistant DA, but from the perspective of a neighbor and of a fellow mom. So as district attorney, I will continue to do that work of integrating into the community, and I will make sure that assistant district attorneys who work in the office are incentivized to do the same. That instead of judging them based on the number of cases they prosecute, that they will be incentivized to work deeply in communities. It should not be a desk job, and I will make sure for everyone at the district attorney's office that it is a community-based job.
That's what I love to hear. That not being a desk job. I was just on a call earlier with some individuals who would remain nameless inside of NYPD, and it was, going on and on about how, they can't be from behind their desk, and so it's very important that you continue. That's what I like to hear. I'm going to pass it to you again. You have more questions.
So, Lucy, I have a question about when wraparound services and community-based initiatives don't necessarily work in stopping the tendency for violent offenders to commit more violent crime. How will your prosecution penalize those people?
Well, I think that it is really important to, and this is going to sound boring, but I know that you'll appreciate it, that it's important that we invest in community-based resources that work, right? That we're not guessing about how to pair people with clinical services, but that we rely on the expertise of social workers, of psychologists, of educators, people who have expertise beyond what lawyers have to determine what the appropriate community-based pairing is for someone. And that may look like violence interruption programs, it may look like restorative justice programs, and it really depends on the totality of the circumstances. But I'm deeply committed to investing in programs that we know work and understanding that it's not going to be the same program in every instance, that we have to explore a breadth of options, both for the person who's charged with the crime and for the person who has experienced the harm.
So, as a little follow-up to that question, when we're seeing a lot of people being sentenced to very long times upstate, and see how that interrupts families and stabilizes communities, looking at those effects, what will your policy be when addressing the harm that is done to these people who move to the community for long stints of time in terms of the secondary effects of maybe symptoms, stabilization in households and such?
I have had set forth from the earliest days of the campaign a racial justice strategy that includes diverting cases out of the system that don't belong there, declining to prosecute matters that don't belong in any system, diverting cases to public health systems wherever possible, and really, to your point, ending the reliance on the kinds of egregiously long sentences that have been one of the primary drivers both of mass incarceration and of racial disparities, unconscionable racial disparities in our system. So I am intending to stop using those kinds of sentences wherever possible. And one example is that in New York State, the felony of possessing a firearm for the first time carries a mandatory minimum of 3.5 years. But by statute, once you've been indicted for that crime, it can be pled down one level, and the mandatory minimum is 2 years. And so traditionally, the district attorneys in New York City have, at least in Manhattan, have just given a 2-year prison sentence for first-time possession with no criminal record, regardless of the facts and circumstances. And that has resulted in untold numbers of young people doing 2 years upstate, totally disrupting their education, their growth process, their families, and that's exactly the kind of policy that I intend to end.
Pass it off here.
Great. So you mentioned wanting to invest in community services that work. So this question is sort of about your philosophy about the role of the DA and its budget. Other progressive candidates have planned to reduce the reach and the budget of the DA's office, given its role in mass incarceration. Do you plan on decreasing the DA's budget and redirecting it to housing, health, education, etc.? And if not, why?
What I commit to is shrinking the footprint of the criminal justice system and the extent to which the system touches far too many people. I think it is irresponsible as a matter of governance to pick an arbitrary number and commit to a reduction of, say, 50% without doing a complete audit of how the budget is being spent. And I also wouldn't commit to a specific number without doing that, without knowing what it's going to be diverted to. So to just say, I will cut the budget and relinquish it and know that the city council could redirect it towards artillery for the police department, for example, would not be the approach I would take. What I do intend to do is to redirect resources from the district attorney's office into pro-social approaches to addressing root causes of the kind of conduct that gets people wrapped up in the criminal justice system.
Great, thank you. And just as sort of a follow-up, how do you plan on assessing the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of it?
Well, I'm glad to see that we're joined by some experts on assessment in the room today, but I really believe in public-private partnerships and in reliance on academic researchers. And I intend as DA to partner closely with nonprofits and academics to make sure that all of our programs are rigorously assessed to make sure that we're spending dollars in the right ways, that they have positive long-term effects. And you know, I think it's also interesting to think about what those metrics are, right? I've heard other people in my race say, well, the thing we should be measuring, the only thing we should be measuring is recidivism. And to my mind, that is an outdated way of looking at this problem. For one thing, in so many cases, we know that relapse is part of recovery, right? And that just because someone recommits an offense they previously committed should not immediately warrant an additional enhanced penalty, especially when the original one clearly didn't work. And if someone's being given a program, for example, and they make an error and get mixed up, they shouldn't be immediately sent upstate for it. We have to be forgiving and understand how human nature works, especially with young people. But the metrics need to be much broader than just whether someone is caught up in the system overall again. And we need to start measuring things like, is someone engaged in pro-social activity like getting a college degree? Is someone reunited with their family? Is someone employed? And those are the kind of metrics that ultimately I want to build into assessing how we are doing as a district attorney's office at serving the community the district attorney is bound to serve.
Thank you, Sarah. I got a question. Do you think it's important and necessary to include real estate developers and urban planners in this community reinvestment? If so, should a strategy involve them?
Real estate developers, I think it's important to include all the stakeholders in the community in these conversations. The district attorney, of course, doesn't have land use authority, but there certainly are ways in which working alongside people who are committed to housing issues can be critically important to informing how the district attorney exercises her power. So I certainly intend to work alongside NYCHA, to work alongside small businesses that are seeking to reemerge after the pandemic, and of course to making sure that tenants are protected from the vagaries of predatory practices in the real estate industry, or from predatory practices by unscrupulous landlords, and even making sure that large agencies like NYCHA are held accountable for any criminal violations.
Just a separate question. A lot of times politicians, when they get to become elected officials, they oftentimes disconnect from the communities that they serve. I guess I want to ask, if you become an elected district attorney, do you plan to continue to have a platform for communities to direct the
as one. And it has been a really fascinating journey since I entered this race and have started to look under the hood of local politics in New York City. But I don't consider myself a politician now, and I will not consider myself one as district attorney. And in fact, I think that it's really important that the district attorney not seek local political endorsements. I think it's important that the district attorney not be beholden to anyone when she takes office, because part of the district attorney's mandate is investigating public corruption and official misconduct. And once someone is in some way politically beholden to a local elected official, it makes it that much harder to be able to do that. So that's why my candidacy has been informed by and supported by the people most impacted by the system, as you know, who have been so much at the core of my evolution of thinking about criminal justice in this country, in this state, and of course in this city.
So actually, I have a quick question about prosecution for financial crimes. So earlier we talked about juvenile offenders. They can fall under the cracks of the system very easily. When you're looking at firms, hedge funds, and big investment banks that are able to get off with their white-collar crimes without sufficient penalty and plead for a fee or a fine that's not really going to make them perceive corrective action, how do you want to prosecute them more efficiently to get the results necessary to get them in compliance?
Yeah. As we expand investigations, prosecutions of official misconduct, public corruption, and white-collar matters, which I believe we must here in Manhattan, I also want to bear in mind the importance of criminal justice reform. And so it is so important to hold people accountable for white-collar crimes, and that requires directing and aggregating resources to get the job done. So what I have proposed to do is bring together two different units of the office that are kind of siloed at the moment, one of which handles the large-scale kind of bank and tax type cases, and one of which handles the sort of economic crimes that affect everyday New Yorkers, identity theft, cybercrime, things that really do terrorize some particularly vulnerable or older communities. And those crimes are under-prosecuted and under-resourced in the city, and we need to make sure we're putting top lawyers on those matters. And at the same time, directing focus towards large-scale bank cases and the sorts of things that we know have resulted in terrible damage to millions of Americans.
And also, will there be any recommendations that you send to the city council on how they should proceed with white-collar crimes? Because of course you are bound by the law and they make the laws. So is there any ideas of how you can advocate in that sphere?
Well, I do think that one of the important roles of the district attorney is advocating for legislative change, both with city council and in Albany. And there are definitely ways in which there's room to enhance penalties for white-collar matters that I think need to be explored.
The hardest question is really hard.
What's my bagel order?
It's much harder.
Oh.
Why should we hope? That's the best.
I am the only candidate in this race who is not beholden to Wall Street interests, to local political interests. I am beholden to the people who are most impacted by the system, to people who have been victims of the most terrible violent crimes, and I'm so honored to have worked alongside families who lost loved ones to police violence, and to have the endorsement and support of Valerie Bell, Sean Bell's mother, Valerie Castile, Orlando Castile's mother, Victoria Davis, Delron's small sister, and others for the work that we did together to create a set of best practices for how prosecutors can ensure accountability for instances of police misconduct. My endorsements and support come from women like them. My endorsements and support come from people I have met behind bars, studying Foucault, talking about Dostoevsky's famous quote about how we judge the state of civilization. And the fact that I have prioritized building a campaign that is mission aligned should demonstrate to all New Yorkers that I intend to build a district attorney's office that is similarly mission aligned. And I'm really proud to have the support of progressive prosecutors from across the country who are doing the work of implementing progressive reforms, because it is an incredibly complex job that involves, in Manhattan, overseeing 500 lawyers, 800 non-legal staff, working with dozens of related agencies to be able to make change. And when I look at the district attorneys who have had the most success in implementing transformative change, I look at Kim Fox in Chicago, at Eric Gonzalez in Brooklyn, at Sarah George in Chittenden County, Vermont, who has endorsed my candidacy and was only the second district attorney in this country to voluntarily end the use of cash bail. Those are all people who came from the offices they are now transforming, who had the expertise in local criminal justice issues, who had community relationships to inform the policies they were making, and who had the credibility and gravitas internally to get the job done in a sustainable way. And that is the candidate I am, and that's the district attorney I intend to be alongside all of you.
You were mentioning, dealing with public corruption and the NYPD. And so just a question about that. When it comes to racism in the NYPD, your campaign is advocating for anti-bias training. Do you believe that that's sufficient, given that it's pretty well documented that racism is inherent to the institution of police? And then further, how do you imagine your office's relationship to the NYPD to function should you be elected?
I worked alongside some of the moms I just named to build out a plan for police accountability, and it includes creating a freestanding unit at the district attorney's office charged with investigating and prosecuting instances of police violence and misconduct. But really, the mandate has to be much larger than that. It has to include the district attorney taking a role in affecting the culture of policing and in cultivating a culture of, as Pastor Isaac Scott and I were talking about earlier today, moving away from a culture of a police force to a culture of a police service. And one of the ways the district attorney can do that is by being very clear that there will be no complicity in disrespect, or certainly not in any kind of misconduct. And assistant DAs spend time at the police academy when they're trained in the earliest days of their training. And just the police department doesn't spend any time training at the district attorney's office. It is time that the district attorney took an active role in articulating to the police department what is acceptable, what is not, and the fact that people will be held accountable.
This is one that's personal and dear to me. New York City faces the challenge of gun and gang violence. There's typical responses when a lot of arrests and incarcerated. Many of the people, most of them young adults, teenagers. How do you plan to respond to what we expect will be some form of violence, violence and murder as
It is so much on my mind, Jerome, because I'm the only candidate in the race who has responded to the scene of street violence and the scene of a young man killed on the street, who has met with a family in one of Manhattan's hospitals after they've experienced the worst possible kind of tragedy. It is the reason that I got in this race that I care about addressing gun violence. But it can't be by reverting back to reliance on excessive sentences, on mandatory minimums, and on treating children like adults. We need to press forward with reforms, and that means investing in violence interrupters and in community-based organizations that we know prioritize prevention, and in recognizing that people who pick up guns are very often motivated by existing traumas and fear, and that the district attorney's obligation to stemming the tide of violence extends to addressing those underlying conditions in order to stop the perpetual retaliatory cycle, which accounts for the vast majority of gun violence in New York City.
Going off that last question, one of my friends I grew up with, he had this saying when he used to carry his weapon on, he used to say, I'd rather get caught with it than without it, because there was such a lack of safety inside the neighborhood, right? And I think, one of the pillars inside of your, campaign is what dignity, equity, and safety, right? So I was wondering, what does community safety look like for you beyond just prosecution?
It is a question of what it looks like for each of the communities that we serve, right? It is, one hopes that it isn't what your friend articulated, right? That it isn't feeling that you'd rather be caught with it than without it. And one way to think about it is in investing in the very earliest parts of people's lives. I mean, I think about the fact that in New York State, there are 80,000 kids who have an incarcerated parent, and those kids are amongst the most at-risk kids in our state. And why we are not doubling down resources to make sure that those kids get the education they deserve and the supportive services they deserve is really beyond me.
I guess as a follow-up to that question, I think one of the things that, I think New York and as a city has been felt upon in, past years has been, especially with the past year gun violence going on in the city, we see a lot of people, wanting to see more convictions for gun violence-related cases. And so how do you kind of withstand public opinion when they want convictions for things that might necessarily be just?
The fear-mongering that has been going on around things like the recent bail reforms is something that the district attorney can and should push back on and be part of correcting. The data doesn't bear out that it is people for whom bail wasn't set who are responsible for the increase in shootings, right? And we really need to educate the public about the fact that like so many other cities emerging from a pandemic into a recession, that New York is experiencing a rise in gun violence, but that is not a reason to revert to the kinds of policies that we know have decimated communities over generations.
I guess I have a follow-up to Tom's question. How would you, so just to give context to it, New York City's response has been to issue mass indictments, gang sweeps, and takedowns, particularly in Manhattan. The largest one was 103 people from Grand Manhattan. Those housing developments. We can't continue this trend of just not being approved of people and believing that that's solving the problem. So my question is, how do you plan to transform the enforcement action that's involved from Operation Group and policing policy into a way that's non-punitive in a way that helps people reconcile differences without imposing?
Well, as you know, I live just a few blocks from Manhattanville and Grant, and feel deeply that we need to think about investing in pro-social supportive services to make sure that young people in that complex and in all of our neighborhoods have options that don't drive them into making decisions that may end up getting caught up in the criminal justice system. But more importantly, we really need to move to a system that treats kids like kids, right? Teenagers don't belong in the adult criminal justice system. We know that through brain science that teenagers don't assess risk in the same way that adults do, even up until 25. So what we really need to do is to direct those cases towards the family court system and towards trauma-informed clinical professionals who can help provide young people with the resources they need rather than locking them up, which we know doesn't, in many cases, doesn't return people better off than when they went away.
So kind of a follow-up. We know that crime happens at the type of institutions and programming and all the stuff that's necessary to help people get out of the situation they're in mentally will take a lot of time. But crime is happening today, crime is happening tomorrow. So how do you rectify the increasing crime that we're projected to see during the summer, unfortunately, and the ideas that we need to invest in these long-term type of programs?
Well, this is why it's so important that we not elect a politician as district attorney, right? And we elect someone who has a track record of service to the city and who is committed to making generational change. Because as you point out, there are going to be many bumps along this road, and the New York Post is going to have a lot of headlines that say that any number of decisions that progressives make are responsible for increasing X, Y, Z. And we have to stay strong and recognize that what we are doing is building towards a different looking future. If we want to make a city where all communities can thrive.
So, sort of similar to what Joelle was asking about, sort of like the RICO cases and that sort of situation. We know that mass incarceration has roots in racism, but we're also seeing technological racism that comes in the form of surveillance of social media accounts, of communities. Do you plan on ending the DA's contract with Palantir, the big data firm that is currently working with the DA's office to surveil communities
Yes.
and social media accounts?
We do.
So, in the first 100 days of your leadership, what is something that we can concretely say that you have done and that we can hold you to?
I expect to end the practice of requesting cash bail.
That's great.
Yeah, you guys are going to have to stand with me when the Post tries to take me down, all right?
And then, I guess in addition to that, by the end of your term, what 3 main things do you hope to have accomplished in addition to the
Well, you know, as I said, I am reluctant to put sort of arbitrary numbers on things. I expect by the end of my first term to have created pathways to services for people who are experiencing mental health crises and for substance misusers. I expect for us to be, as a county, to be using public health responses to those kinds of crises by the end of my first term. I expect to have meaningfully increased the numbers of social workers and trauma-informed clinical experts at the district attorney's office and making them available, their expertise available, both to people who've been victimized and to people who are charged with a crime. And perhaps most notably, I expect to, as I have committed from the very first day of my campaign, to make good on the promise that there will be no backroom meetings between well-heeled defense attorneys and the district attorney and my senior staff, because it is clear to me that that practice has undermined the public's perception of the integrity of that office, and that it simply must stop.
I have a question. One of the things everybody on this panel is very familiar with, and one of kind of the cornerstones of the Justice Ambassadors is this question of what does justice look like to you? And so I think, one of the, wherever we go, that's the question we ask. It's the question we ask the first day of class and the end of class to kind of gauge our students' perceptions of change. And so I want to pose that question to you. What does justice look like to you?
I was asked in a questionnaire earlier this week, what's your favorite neighborhood in New York City? And it seems like it's such an impossible question, but the answer that came to me is Morningside Park, because it's my neighborhood park and it is where my children are at their most joyful. So I think what justice looks like to me is all families having a Morningside Park and feeling that their children are safe there and are in community there, and knowing that we can rely on our neighbors and on the services and the public servants who are taking an oath to protect us, to do that in a way that is equitable and that recognizes the inherent dignity of all of our children.
This is a follow-up to Justice Extension, which we did in Justice. I'm sorry. Do you plan to push legislation to the government for earned limited time probation for anyone sentenced to terminate or indeterminate sentence? I'll explain that for those who don't know. Indeterminate is someone sentenced to a split bid, 25 to life is the split bid, 5 to 15 is the split bid. The terminated as a flat number 5, 10 years, flat numbers. Early limited time credit is an opportunity for people to serve half of their time and then be eligible for early release before serving the mandatory 60 or 75 or 85% of their time, so midway through.
And I think Darrell's not giving himself enough credit. This is an idea that came out of the work that you did in class. And I am certainly wholeheartedly in support of that, as I am in support of all legislation and policies that give people a second chance, that allow for a look back, that recognize people's inherent ability to grow and to change, and that offer opportunities to reduce mass incarceration.
So, the legal system can be very complex and can cause a lot of confusion, especially for juvenile offenders who might be first offense, second offense. So, what will the DA do to make sure that these people coming into the system unaware understand what is going on?
Those cases, in my view, are better served in family court than in the adult criminal justice system. And folks are better off paired with attorneys who have expertise in working with juveniles and in explaining to juveniles and their families what is happening in a way that, frankly, assistant district attorneys are not trained to do, and in my view, should not be the people.
And will this hold you in the cases of violent crime?
Yes.
Does the viewers have any questions?
Not that they posted, but no. So you guys have 10 minutes. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm interested a little bit in like how your past work inside the Manhattan DA's office shapes your kind of viewpoint on the role of the DA moving forward.
Yeah. Well, there's a gun case that I have had on my mind a bit because of the rise in violence that we're seeing, and it's a case in which a 17-year-old shot another one on Upper Madison Avenue many years ago, and caused very significant damage to the young man's back who he shot. And it turns out that it was a conflict over a video game. I mean, it was as foolish as that. And so this really speaks to what's wrong with guns, because of course they might have gotten in a fist fight had they not had a gun, but someone wouldn't have ended up nearly paralyzed. But I went to the hospital, I met the young man who'd been shot, I met his family, I persuaded him to come testify in the grand jury, which he did. The grand jury indicted the person who shot him. That person was apprehended, and the case was pending. And not 2 weeks later, I was supervising in the place where police bring reports when someone has been arrested, and it was a familiar name that came across my desk on a police report for a shooting. And when I looked into it, it turned out that it was the brother of the young man who had been shot in my case, who in this case had shot the person who shot his brother and now was arrested for that shooting. And it was an early example to me of how the tools of prosecution alone just don't do the trick, and how we have to do something very different in order to stop that kind of cycle. And to my mind, the answer comes from Darrell. It comes from any number of the students I've worked with inside prison, but ideally people we're working with before they get wrapped up in the system, to help identify what the conflicts are, what the needs are, and how they can be resolved in a way that doesn't result in someone getting tragically hurt.
What, as far as working with people before they enter the criminal justice system, what, I guess, power or what resources does your office have to do that?
Well, amongst so the office currently has a community partnerships unit, which is sort of its own unit that goes to street fairs and liaises with community groups. And what I intend to do is to essentially integrate that unit into the whole of the office, so that all assistant district attorneys have access to and work alongside community liaisons and are encouraged themselves to work closely work closely with communities. And part of that is investing in local community-based resources that are focused on prevention. But I think that it is, again, a little bit beyond just sort of directing money places. That a huge part of it is effectuating a culture change where assistant district attorneys become integrated into communities. One of my mentors, the Commonwealth's attorney for Portsmouth, Virginia, Stephanie Morales, who is an incredible force of nature, and she has successfully tried 2 police officers who shot and killed Black men in her community. And what she says when asked about how she can possibly hold police accountable given how closely her office works with them is, I should be as close to every member of my community as I would ever be perceived to be to a police officer. And so that's sort of how I think about the kind of office I intend to build, one that is so deeply integrated into communities that that every case is hard to bring because of how close the district attorney is to the communities.
So the DA's office often deals with implications of inequity and lack of resources in the community. So that means on the back end, probably discussion with the DOE, with the Department of Youth and Community Development is going to be necessary in order to manifest ideas and policies that you have. So what does your communication look like with other New York City agencies in actualizing your goals?
Well, it's one of the exciting things about the role of the American district attorney. You know, we're the only country in the world that elects our DAs, and that has potential challenges to it, some of which I've referenced. But it also has a tremendous upside, which is that the district attorney is directly accountable to us, and can actually act faster than the state legislature in many respects. And that's why the great tradition of prosecutorial discretion means that the DA can decide, no, I'm simply not going to prosecute possession of narcotics for personal use because my community doesn't view that as warranting a criminal justice response. And that's well within the authority of the district attorney. So I say all of that to say that the DA, as a result of being elected, has a bully pulpit unlike that of the head of many other agencies who are appointed, which is why I see it as a tremendously important role for convening other agencies to direct resources to collaboratively solving problems, so much in the way that the justice ambassadors seek to do.
So we have one question from the audience. The question, very surprisingly, why do you want to become DA? Yeah, no, right? Of all the questions, why do you want to be?
You know, honestly, last March, my family all came down with COVID, and thankfully everyone emerged all right. But it was a long road, and my folks were sick, quite sick, and my partner and I, and my sister, and her partner, and we emerged from that. And I was running a nonprofit that I loved out of CUNY, working with district attorneys around the country as they tried to figure out what to do as courts were shutting down, and realizing that we needed to do something about jail populations because of COVID spread. And the work mattered tremendously. And then George Floyd got murdered, and I heard from district attorney partners all over the country who were in crisis and said, we don't know how to reckon with this as an office. We don't know how to talk to our staff about it. And I watched the field for district attorney here in Manhattan shaping up, and I thought, there is no one in this field who has the depth of experience serving here in Manhattan and understands the way the system works and the way the city works, and who has the expertise of working with progressive DAs around the country on implementing change. And I thought to myself, looking at my kids, who I was looking at all the damn time because we were all home all day, and I thought, you know, who do I want to be to them? Someone who does something hard that I've never done before, where I'm not sure of the outcome, or someone who sticks with a great and meaningful job but doesn't take a risk. And ultimately, I decided, looking at my 5-year-old daughter, that the person I want to be is the one who takes the risk to make the change that I think is so long overdue.
That's all the questions that I have. Any lingering questions or closing thoughts from any of my fellows on this here panel?
All my questions answered. Lucy, thank you so much. It was very happy.
Yes, thank you so much.
Can I ask Lucy, you just any message you want to leave to young people, youth who may be watching, may watch it later, and/or people who work directly with youth and may have not the best perspective about them? You know, you sat here and held a I felt like this conversation was better than the one we had earlier, but both were very profound. And look at who's hosting this with you. You know, this speaks volumes to what young people can do. And I just wondered if you wanted to speak on that a little bit with respects to how bad, you know, the narrative is about young people, especially when it comes to all of the violence we're seeing. And it's just taking the full burden for that. Like, they're the only persons out here doing it. You know?
To all the young people out there, I see you, and I commit to continuing to see you and working with you to build a better city for all of us. There is more about my plans, many of which Jarrell and Pastor Isaac and others have been critical to developing, available at votelucyline.com. And I invite you to reach out anytime, share your thoughts, feedback, and ideas. We are all evolving as this field evolves. And we can only do it if we hold people accountable. And I'm asking you, and I feel sure that Jarrell will, to hold me accountable for the commitments that I've made in this campaign and to implementing them as district attorney. My email is lucylangynyc@gmail.com. Please feel free to reach out and follow me on social media at lucylangynyc, and know that with me as district attorney, we will have a fully functioning youth advisory council to the DA who convene regularly to talk about policy issues, to evaluate data coming out of the office, and to make sure that there is an open exchange of ideas between the office leadership and especially young people in our communities. So I'm counting on you. Get me elected, and then to hold me accountable and to help me build a better city.